All right. I assume you can see that. Wait for the current slide. All right. So that's me, by the way. It's at least it was when I was younger. All right. So I don't have any disclosures. All right. Let's talk about anxiety. So anxiety is, it's 100%, right? Everybody understands what we're talking about with anxiety, although anxiety disorders are not the same as anxiety. And one of the things we have to be a little careful of is jumping back and forth between kind of the lay term anxiety and the diagnostic, like an anxiety disorder, because one is kind of everywhere and the other is not that common. So we don't want to blur all that together. But, the biggest issue is that 20% of the population of all of us have kind of an anxious temperament. We're at risk for anxiety. So that 1/5 of people really are at higher risk and are probably stumbling more with the pandemic than everybody else. So we all know who we are. If you tend to be a little anxious, a little shy, a little slow to warm up to things, then you have a problem. And the percentage of people with anxiety disorders has actually jumped a lot with the pandemic. So it's not just an illusion. It seems to be true. It came up in my room. One of the problems is that kids, well, you guys mentioned it too. If you're anxious, then you miss some school, then it starts a cycle, and then your sleep hygiene gets off. And so it's very hard to get up in the morning. And then you just get more and more out of the loop until you're really buried. So one of the big concerns is failure to launch. These kids are going to finish high school and not be ready to live in the world and not be ready to go to work and to take care of themselves and to be responsible. So we really do have to figure out how to strengthen people back up again after this pandemic. So you get a lot of symptoms of, stomach ache, headache, everything like that, of cognitive stuff, including being very catastrophic. People tend to now feel more catastrophic about little things. And separation problems when you get really used to being home, it's hard to leave. And social problems when you haven't hung out with your friends for a couple of years, except online. It's very weird to be around them, right? The first time you kind of went and hung out with your friends or went out to dinner after a long stretch of not going, it feels a little bit weird, like, oh my goodness, there's all these three-dimensional people here. I'm not used to that. There are some good screening tools for anxiety disorders. The one I like to use is the SCARED. It's 41 questions, which seems a little bit long, but it gives you a really good profile. It's not diagnostic. It just you use it along with your interview to try to sort things out, because some people will over-report and some people will under-report, but it's a pretty good tool and gives you a good profile. There's a shorter one for teenagers, the GAD-7, which is only 7 questions, but I don't think it gives you as much. And I'm not going to talk about the other ones right now. So this is what the SCARED looks like. It goes down through these things, and it's like true, sometimes, often, and all you do is add up the numbers. And, I don't even look, there's a way to score all these different things for different kinds of disorders. I don't ever do that. I just add it all up. And if it's over 25, then that person's at high risk to have an anxiety disorder. So it's a pretty good screener for people who are really a concern. So, and I use it all the time, and you can follow it over time too. So if you're trying some interventions with kids, you can follow this over and over. There's no retest problem. So what's the best approach? Well, the hard fact is the only approach that's useful for anxiety is exposure, right? So that's the only thing that works. So you can be as nice as you want, but it doesn't help people. So everything else we do is trying to set up and build strengths and skills so people can tolerate the exposure they need to get better. So that's just the way it is. So, when we talk about giving people, like if they're stressed out in class, they can go to a safe place and talk to a favorite person, things like that. That's okay. But the fact is that every time they avoid something, they're kind of slowing down the process of getting readjusted. So if you think about some of the efforts people have to make, it's kind of like a cold swimming pool. Like if you got to get in it and you got to stay in there if you're going to get used to it. And you can't, if you keep getting out and laying in the sun, then when you get back in, it doesn't feel too good, right? So even though I understand that this is hard, it's the way to get stronger. So, if you want to get comfortable with public speaking, then you sign up for Toastmasters and you do it a million times. You don't hide somewhere and don't do it for a decade and then think you're going to be okay when you do it. No, it's just going to get worse. So the only way to address it is to face it and to desensitize yourself to it. Now, in the meantime, you can do all sorts of things. So, people were talking about kind of educating families around it and educating staff around it. And that's helpful because every time you educate somebody, they feel more comfortable, right? You're less emotional if you're more informed. So if you're well educated, that like, okay, I think I understand this. So I've worked with lots of families where there was school refusal, right? Trying to help the families understand, okay, I understand what you're doing and how this pattern is going. It's like, and I try to be very sensitive to that. I said, but there's another way to love your child. And what your child needs for you to do is to be strong and to be calm and firm and guide them and help them understand where there is a real risk and where there's a perceived risk, but there's really no risk. And to not, the fact that they're distressed by it doesn't mean that it's dangerous. That doesn't, so they're misperceiving and they need the adults to be strong and to be calm and to be firm and to help them do what they need to do. So now, if you want to organize this, you can, there's an organized cognitive behavioral therapy kind of program you can use that teaches about anxiety and it teaches coping skills and cognitive restructuring. And you can get good at this. But as a general philosophy, I think people have to understand that the only way to get through an anxiety situation like this is to get back in the game. You have to, you just can't do anything else. So if you say, well, it's too much for some kids, well, they need to rebuild their mental muscles. I call it mental. So they might have a reentry plan to school. So they start slowly and you add more, but you have to march along relentlessly. They never say, okay, I feel good, let's go up a notch. No, they never say that. They get kind of comfortable. You raise it a notch, they hate you again. And then after a while, they get comfortable and you raise it another notch and they hate you again. So they're not asking to have exposure work. You have to kind of nudge people along and support them. There is the possibility of medicine, which is SSRIs can be very helpful for anxiety disorders, not the delay term anxiety, but an anxiety disorder, which you have a chronic anxiety problem and significant impairment and stuff like that. So, and what is striking about this is if you do the cognitive behavioral work and you are on an SSRI, there's an 83% response rate, which means 83% get into remission, which is a lot, right? That's a lot of kids. So if you could, now it's hard because it's hard to get people to do CBT. It's hard to get people an assessment for their anxiety and to do a trial of medicine because they worry to death about the medicine, right? Because usually the parent has an anxiety problem too. And so they always have all these side effects. It's always terrible. So just to remind you, the other thing that I do is I work with primary care docs. And so you can nudge a family to go see their pediatrician or family medicine practitioner or nurse practitioner, whoever works with them, and say, hey, this kid has a lot of anxiety. Can we try to sort that out, do some screening tools and interview? And so the pediatricians can often handle treating kids for anxiety. They don't have to have a psychiatrist or a psychiatric nurse practitioner because we all know how difficult the access is right now. So, this is not something that's beyond the realm of a pediatrician. So that's, and if they're nervous, they can call me. I'm the Friday guy. They can call me on Fridays to talk about stuff. So because just look at those numbers, so the CBT itself is about 50 or 60%. The SSRI is about 50, and you add them up and they're over 80%. So it's really important. But exposure, you cannot, avoidance is the symptom, right? Everybody who's anxious wants to avoid. That's probably why we have anxiety, to protect us from real danger. The problem is it misfires and it protects us from things like going to English class. That's really not that dangerous. You really should go. They say, well, but I'm really stressed. And it's like, that's a false alarm. You need to go to English class. And if you go, you'll be okay. If you get behind, it's going to be worse. So you really can't, that doesn't really work. Some kids have a lot of trouble. If they actually get sick, they get an illness and then they miss a few days, and then coming back is super hard. So, they get the flu and they're out for a month instead of a week. And the first week is medical and the rest of it's mental health. The other thing is you can see, that's why I hesitate with that whole idea of having a mental health day, someone not coming to school because they, feel like they need a mental health day. Well, the problem is if your problem is anxiety, that's going to create a bigger avoidance, right? It's an avoidance. And in your classroom, it's also, if you get upset, and so the intervention is you get to hang out with your favorite person in the world, right? Then one of the challenges is that that's very reinforcing. So you got to be careful about how reinforcing you are when people are leaving what they're supposed to be doing, and they're leaving that experience to come get support from you. You have to kind of be supportive and a little grumpy at the same time. So you have to have an expectation that they go back to class, and that we're just doing this, you do whatever skill you're working on, some abdominal breathing, some positive visualization, some whatever you're going to do, and then you get yourself calm and go back to class. So you don't want to overdo the level of accommodation for that. And so just to think philosophically about this, these are the experiences you can have at school, right? From in-home instruction, which is like no school, to all classes all day plus extracurriculars, right? And there's this whole, like, this is a more. And what do you get more of is all of these things on top. You manage unstructured time, you interact with a lot of different adults, a lot of different kids, and you get the richest academic content, right? So this is why you want to go all day and do all this stuff. But why do you suffer through? Why not just hang out here? Right. And so and my answer is these are the skills that we're trying to build in high school and all through school, so kids can function as young adults, right? They need resilience, stamina, strength, adaptability, social skills, and to be autonomous. And how do you build those strengths? Well, you have to build them a little at a time. If you're going to run a marathon, you don't put on your sneaker and go run a marathon. You have to work at a mile, and you have to work at 2 miles, and you have to work at 5 miles. So you cannot build resilience by one shot. It has to be over and over and repetitive. And so doing it all day in as many classes as you can with as little help as possible. So you really get strong. So you're trying to build strength in kids and not just accommodate them. And so they can feel calm and taken care of, but then they don't have their own internal strength. So they need to internalize this strength. So you can't, it's not a crash course. It's a slow grind, but part of it is constant exposure and nudging kids back out there into the mainstream as much as they can. All right. So why does it go wrong? Because exposure is not a natural response, right? So if you have something that makes you nervous, the last thing you want to do is do that all the time, right? So if flying makes you uncomfortable, you say, oh, I'm going to arrange to fly, once a week for the next 6 months. That is not what we do. We avoid, right? We avoid the thing that makes us uncomfortable. And parents protect kids from the things that make them uncomfortable, which is okay if you have an immediate short-term problem. But if you have a long-term anxiety problem, you have to stop protecting your kid, and you have to nudge them. You have to drag them out from behind your leg and make them say hi to people and stuff like that. And families have trouble with that because it runs in the family and it's contagious. And, so I work very hard with what I call the weakest link, and not to disparage the person who's facilitating their anxiety avoidance, but to value them, to say, you are the person. So I've had many meetings where towards the end, there's a grumpy grandmother over in the corner, and I'm like, okay, you don't like this. Well, you don't like the way this is going. Tell me what's going on with you. And they're like, oh, you make that sound so simple, it's going to be hard. And so I stay with them and empathize with them and support them and say, now, if you drop off your kid and they're falling apart, and that's very upsetting to you, and there are tears in your eyes as you're pulling out of the loop, who do you call to get some support? How do you take care of yourself? Because when parents have to watch their child in distress, it's very hard for them to do that. So that's why they have a hard time getting them out the door in the morning. It's painful. So just, you have to respect that it's not simple. The solution seems, intellectually simple, but emotionally very complex. The other thing is, in order for us to understand families, we have to listen better. So when they can't get that kid out of bed, instead of just being, kind of like, come on, you got it, it's your job. You have to understand what happens. What's it feel like when you try to get them up? What's it sound like? What's going on in your morning? What's going on with the other kids? Do you have a spouse, and what are they doing? And how does this all go? So you really understand what they're trying to go through, so you can help them in a more focused sort of way. The other thing that came up in my little breakout room is there are safe people. Schools need to have safe people that anxious parents can talk to, right? So when Junior comes home and says, hey, my math teacher cursed me out today, and so I don't want to go back to school, the parent needs to say, I'm going to call Mrs. Jones, because I know Mrs. Jones, and I'll let her get to the bottom of this, but you have to go to school tomorrow. So there has to be someone who they can call to make sure that what's going on is what's going on. Because kids, they're clever, right? If they want to avoid, they come up with a good story. The other thing is, administrators need to understand, school administrators, that sometimes anxious kids are noisy, right? Sometimes anxious kids, if you nudge them, then once in a while, they fall apart, right? They fall apart and they have a tantrum or an outburst. And so that's, if kids never fall apart because you're nudging them, then you're probably not nudging them enough. So I tell schools and I tell parents, it's okay. It's not the end of the world if a kid has a tantrum or an outburst or he falls apart or storms around. Once in a while, that's going to happen. And that's, so it's not that anybody did anything wrong. It doesn't require anybody to do anything wrong. So administrators have to have a certain tolerance for the hallway to be disruptive once in a while, and for someone to flip out once in a while. And if it's always quiet in your hallways, then you're over accommodating these kids, because you need to nudge them, and once in a while they're going to kind of fall apart. And remember, we're in this for the long game and not just the short game. We're looking down the road. We want these kids to be ready to be young adults. And, even though between here and there, it could be a little noisy and bumpy once in a while. And I tell people, listen, if you raise kids, I raised 3 kids, they thank you when they're around 30. Okay. They don't thank you when you're making them do stuff they don't want to do. So when you're raising kids, you're raising teenagers, when you're controlling their video gaming and you're taking away their phone and you're making them go to bed at night, all that kind of stuff, they're not too fond of all that stuff. You're not going to be their friend until they grow up and maybe have kids, and then they need your help, and then things turn around. But in the short run, parenting is hard work, and you feel like you make enemies sometimes. And this, just to say, this is how you try to circle the wagons, right? These are all the kind of providers that I could think of when I was doing this. And remember, the child and family are in the middle here. But you got people in the school, you got the primary care provider, and you have mental health providers out there in various agencies. And we're all trying to work together. And when you have an anxious kid who's trying to avoid, you really have to circle the wagons and try to make sure everybody's working together. And that's really all through communication. You have to figure out ways to communicate. So if parents are trying to reach you, get through to them. If there's a problem, get through to the primary care office. If the primary care office is trying to talk to you in school, make it easy for them. Do your best, because you're all on the same team. You're trying to do the same thing for these kids and families. All right, these are some resources. The big study I talked about with 80% is the CAM study. There's a Coping Cats program, which is a structured CBT program for kids with anxiety. There's a teenage version of that called the CAT program. There are some great websites, Anxiety Canada and Mini Mind Masters program, that are all various ways to kind of coach people and teach skills. And what you're doing is you're teaching and coaching until they can tolerate exposure. It's all about exposure, remember, but you want to be ready for the exposure, but eventually it has to happen.